in my wedding gown. I walked down the aisle with Daniel's family by my side. Their smiles were steady, but the empty seats where my parents should have been pierced, my heart, just as I whispered my vows. My phone buzzed, Mom's name flashing. Her words urgent. "This is your fault." My hands trembled. "My name is Elena Carter." And I was 28 years old the day I walked down the aisle in a gown that felt heavier than it should have. The church was breathtaking. White roses curled around the arch. Soft golden candles lit the path. And a string quartet played a melody so tender it seemed to float in the air. Guests turned in their seats, their faces lit with expectation, their whispers folding into the music. It should have been the happiest day of my life. People said a wedding was the moment when every little girl's dream finally came true, but as I clutched my bouquet and tried to steady my breath, I kept looking toward the front row. 2 chairs sat empty, the chairs reserved for my parents. I told myself to keep walking, to smile, to let the day carry me forward. But my eyes betrayed me. They searched the doors, hoping for a miracle, for the sudden appearance of the 2 people who should have been there more than anyone else. My heart whispered, maybe they'll come in late, maybe they'll slip into their seats just in time. Smiling, proud, finally choosing me. But the doors never opened. The weight of those empty chairs pressed harder than the fitted bodice on my chest. Around me, the whispers began to ripple. "Where are her parents?" I heard from the left. A sharper voice followed. Quieter but impossible to ignore. "I can't believe they didn't come." The words stung, searing like salt against an open wound. I lifted my chin, trying to pretend I hadn't heard. Trying to pretend I wasn't still that little girl who begged for her parents' attention. The chandeliers above sparkled too brightly, almost mocking, spilling light across my loneliness. Step by step, I walked forward, as if each movement was a test of endurance. The music sounded hollow, my smile forced, my heart aching. My wedding day, the one day I thought I would never have to question where I belonged, had become a reminder that family doesn't always mean love. Those chairs, those glaring, unforgiving chairs remained empty. And in that emptiness, I felt the truth settle in my chest, no matter how much I longed for it. My parents were never going to choose me. I must have looked like I was about to collapse because suddenly, I felt a gentle hand slip into mine. I turned, and there was Thomas, Daniel's father. His eyes were kind, steady, the kind of eyes that saw right through your pain without judgment. He leaned closer and whispered, "You are not alone. Elena, not today, not ever, is affected as we're having out." The words unraveled something in me. My throat tightened, tears pressing at the corners of my eyes. I tried to smile, tried to show strength, but my lips trembled. In that instant, I realized how desperately I had wanted someone, anyone, to choose me. Across the altar, Daniel was watching me. His gaze wasn't just loving, it was reassuring, grounding, like an anchor thrown into the storm of my heart. The way he looked at me said, "I see you. I choose you. I always will." That look alone kept me standing when everything inside me wanted to collapse. The guests seemed to sense the shift. A quiet ripple of applause moved through the room, soft but warm, like an embrace. It filled some of the hollow space left by those empty chairs. For a moment, I allowed myself to breathe, to feel the comfort of belonging to a family not tied by blood but by choice. As I stood there, caught between the ache of abandonment and the unexpected comfort of acceptance, my thoughts turned inward. They say a wedding is supposed to be the happiest day of your life, the moment when all your dreams line up, when family gathers to bless your future. But for me, it was the day I finally understood that family isn't always where you come from. Sometimes, it's what you build. And sometimes, it's what chooses you, even when the people who should have loved you never did. I looked again at those 2 empty chairs, sharp and cold like a scar carved into a celebration. Then I turned back to Thomas, still holding my hand, steadying me with his presence. In that moment, it felt as though I was standing on a fragile bridge between two worlds, one defined by rejection, the other by the possibility of love and belonging. And though my heart still ached, I knew I had a choice. I could keep longing for the family who turned away. Or I could step toward the family reaching out to me now. I can trace the hollow ache in my chest back to moments like this long before my wedding day. Before empty chairs and forced smiles. I was 13. Clutching a letter that I thought would finally make my parents proud. It was an acceptance letter into the advanced placement program at my school. A track reserved for the top students. My hands shook as I carried it to the dinner table. My heart pounding with the thrill of finally having something worthy enough to show them. Dinner at our house was always noisy. Mostly because Isabelle could fill a room with her voice. That night was no different. She had just come back from a school competition. And even before the food was on the table, she was humming the song that had won her first place. Her voice was light, melodic, and it drew smiles the way a flame draws moths. Still, I thought, maybe, just maybe, I had something to contribute to. When the plates were set, I waited for a pause in the chatter, then slid the crisp letter across the table. My chest swelled with anticipation as I said, I got into the honors track at school. They said it's one of the hardest programs. But I made it. It was something that it was. My mother glanced at the paper, eyes skimming the words for barely a heartbeat before she turned back to Isabelle. Did you tell your father about the trophy? Sweetheart? She said, her voice brimming with warmth. My father chuckled, his gaze never leaving my sister. A first-place medal. Huh? That's my girl. He reached across the table to ruffle Isabelle's hair. And she laughed, soaking in their pride like sunlight. The letter I had been so proud of lay untouched beside the breadbasket. The silence that followed my announcement was louder than any words they could have spoken. My cheeks burned. But I forced a smile, nodding as if their indifference didn't cut me to pieces. I tried again. The teachers said this program could help with college applications someday. My voice was small, almost apologetic, but by then my mother and father were deep into conversation about Isabelle's voice lessons, about finding a better coach, about how far her talent could take her. Their laughter filled the room, drowning out the quiet plea in my tone. So I folded the letter back into its envelope and slipped it under my notebook. The excitement that had carried me into the dining room drained out, leaving me hollow and strangely heavy. I finished my meal in silence, staring at the patterns on my plate, pretending not to hear every word of praise that wasn't meant for me. That was the night I began to learn a lesson that would take years to unlearn. In our house, achievements were only as valuable as the applause they drew. Isabelle's voice could command a room. But my hard work, my long nights bent over textbooks, my victories on paper, they barely made a ripple. I didn't stop trying after that. But I stopped expecting. Each time I held out my accomplishments, it was with the quiet knowledge that they would likely be overlooked. That night was only the beginning of shrinking myself, of slipping into the background while the spotlight shone on her. And though I told myself it didn't matter, the truth is, it did. It mattered deeply. It shaped the way I saw myself, the way I doubted my worth, and the way I kept chasing a kind of love that never seemed to have room for me. Graduation day was supposed to be one of the brightest chapters of my life, the culmination of years spent buried in books, late nights at the library, and mornings fueled only by coffee and determination. I had done it. I was graduating with honors, the kind of distinction that meant every sacrifice had been worth it. Walking across that stage felt like stepping into the promise of a new beginning. I remember the gown hanging heavy on my shoulders, the cap threatening to slide off my head, and the applause echoing through the auditorium as names were called one after another. My name was near the top of the list, and I held my breath as I climbed the stairs to the stage, diploma waiting in the hands of the dean. For a moment, I let myself imagine it differently. I pictured my parents in the crowd, their faces lit with pride. My mother clutching tissues she'd prepared, just in case she cried. My father standing to clap louder than anyone else. I imagined Isabelle beside them. Maybe even grudgingly happy for me. That picture lived so vividly in my mind it almost felt real. But when I looked down into the audience, reality cut sharper than I expected. 2 seats in the front row were empty. The very ones I had reserved weeks earlier with their names neatly written on the cards. The auditorium was packed with families waving signs, snapping photos, and cheering until their voices cracked. Beside me, one of my classmates pointed to his parents and siblings who had brought balloons and a bouquet of roses. His father whistled proudly as his name was called. And me? The only familiar face I found was Clara, my closest friend. She was waving with both hands. A grin stretched wide across her face, shouting my name as if her voice alone could fill the silence left by theirs. I clung to that smile, grateful for her presence. But the ache still lodged itself deep inside my chest. I knew where my parents were. Isabelle had a big audition that very same day. One they deemed too important to miss. They had promised me they'd try to come after. But I had heard that promise enough times to know better. Isabelle's dream always came first. And mine could wait. The diploma felt almost weightless in my hands as I walked off the stage. Even though I had expected it to be the heaviest, a most meaningful thing I'd ever carried. The applause followed me, but none of it belonged to the people I wanted most. I forced myself to smile, even as tears threatened at the corners of my eyes. Clara caught me in the hallway afterward, wrapping me in a hug so tight it almost convinced me I wasn't alone. Almost. I thanked her, and I meant it. But as the crowd thinned and families reunited in clusters of joy, the emptiness around me grew louder. I tried to remind myself that I had accomplished something great, something no absence could erase. And yet, the truth was cruelly simple. Victories feel smaller when there's no one there to witness them. That day, in the middle of the cheers and camera flashes, I had never felt more invisible. Looking back, I realized graduation wasn't just one isolated disappointment. It was part of a pattern. A long string of moments where my victories seemed to vanish before anyone had the chance to notice them. In high school, I won a regional essay competition. The certificate was printed on crisp white paper, my name bold in elegant letters. I brought it home, expecting, no, hoping for even the smallest recognition. My mother glanced at it briefly, then set it aside on the counter, her attention already drifting toward Isabelle, who was rehearsing a new song in the living room. The certificate stayed there for days, collecting dust, until I quietly tucked it into a drawer. It happened again in college. I was invited to present a research paper at a conference, a rare honor for someone my age. I sent photos of the event to my parents, thinking maybe this time they'd call. Maybe this time they'd tell me they were proud. The phone never rang. When I called to check in, the conversation quickly turned to Isabelle's latest performance, her prospects, her glowing reviews from teachers and peers. My news barely earned a pause before it was brushed aside. I started noticing it even in family pictures. We'd gather around during the holidays, all of us trying to fit into the frame. Isabelle always in the center, my parents leaning toward her, their hands resting proudly on her shoulders. I would stand to the side, sometimes half-blocked, sometimes cut off at the edges. Later, when the photos were framed and displayed around the house, my absence was almost comical. There I was, blurred in the background, or hidden behind Isabelle's hair, a ghost in my own family. Over time, I learned to adjust. I practiced a smile in the mirror, one that looked convincing enough to hide the sting. I mastered the art of clapping enthusiastically for Isabelle while swallowing the ache in my chest. At gatherings, I nodded and laughed at stories that excluded me, as though being invisible was the role I had been assigned, and I'd finally decided to play it well. It's strange how the body remembers what the heart wants to forget. Even now, I catch myself tilting slightly in photographs, angling my shoulders away, as if instinctively making room for someone else. I hear the echo of compliments I never received, and feel the hollow space where encouragement should have been. I won't pretend it didn't hurt. It did, over and over again. But after a while, the hurt dulled. It stopped feeling like sharp glass and settled into something heavier. A quiet weight I carried around like it belonged to me. I told myself I didn't need their validation, that I was strong enough on my own. And maybe, in some ways, I was. But strength built from being unseen isn't the same as being loved. So I smiled. Even when my heart ached. I laughed. Even when my throat tightened. I played along with the unspoken rule that Isabelle was the star. And I was just the shadow standing beside her. That shadow became my second skin. And after a while, I couldn't tell where it ended and where I began. I still remember the day I met Daniel as clearly as if it happened yesterday. It was a gray afternoon. The kind where the clouds hung low and the world felt muted. Like it was forcing you to turn inward. I had ducked into a small cafe near campus. The kind of place where the windows fogged up in winter and the tables wobbled just a little. It wasn't glamorous. But it was quiet. And quiet was something I craved. I sat in my usual corner with a worn notebook and a paperback tucked beneath my arm. Writing had become my escape. On those pages, I could pour the words no one else seemed interested in hearing. That day, I was scribbling thoughts about invisibility, how easy it was to fade into the background until even you forgot you were there. That's when I noticed a shadow fall across my table. I looked up, startled. And there he was. Daniel. He wasn't smiling in that forced, overly polite way most people do when they're about to interrupt a stranger. His expression was curious. Almost gentle. "Is that Steinbeck you're reading?" he asked, nodding toward the book by my elbow. For a moment, I froze. People didn't usually notice what I was reading, let alone care enough to ask. I hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, East of Eden. It's one of my favorites." It is Offender's Possessions Potomation. Something in his eyes lit up. Like I had just revealed a secret worth keeping. He pulled out the chair across from me without waiting for an invitation. Though not in an arrogant way, more like he belonged there. "I love that one," he said, resting his forearms on the table. "The way Steinbeck talks about good and evil being in all of us. It's honest. To get let out." I remember feeling my defenses go up. Just out of habit. I wasn't used to strangers caring about my thoughts, let alone wanting to share theirs. I kept my voice measured, almost cautious. "Most people think it's too heavy. Innispi and incaprizit and bice. Most people don't listen long enough," he replied, tilting his head as if he could see straight through the wall I had carefully built. That response caught me off guard. I should have brushed him off and returned to my notebook. I'm gone back to the safety of my own silence. But instead, I found myself talking. Little things at first. Why I loved the book. What I saw in its characters. And Daniel didn't just nod along, waiting for his turn to speak. He leaned in. He asked questions. He repeated back things I said like they mattered. At one point, I must have let something personal slip. A small confession about always feeling like the background character in my own story. I braced myself for him to laugh it off or change the subject. But he didn't. Instead, he looked at me with a kind of quiet conviction and said, "You deserve to be seen. Elena, you deserve to be valued." The words hit me harder than I expected. It felt like someone had opened a window in a room I didn't realize was suffocating me. Nobody had ever told me that before, not in that way. Not with that kind of certainty. I didn't know what to say. My first instinct was suspicion. That maybe he was just being kind for the sake of it. But there was something steady in his gaze. Something that made me believe he wasn't performing. For the first time in a long while, I felt the heavy layers of invisibility slip. Just a little. And in their place, I felt seen. Truly seen. The first time Daniel invited me to have dinner with his family, I almost said no. I wasn't used to being included like that. And part of me worried I'd be out of place. sitting in a room full of people who had known and loved each other for years. Families, in my experience, were complicated spaces. Mine was a place where I always had to earn attention, where love felt conditional, doled out in crumbs. The thought of walking into someone else's family home was intimidating. But Daniel had a way of making things feel safe. "They'll love you," he promised as he squeezed my hand before we walked up to the front door. His confidence was steady, like he knew something I couldn't quite believe yet. When the door opened, I was greeted by the warm scent of garlic bread and roasted chicken. Laughter drifted from the kitchen, the kind of easy laughter that comes from people who enjoy one another's company. My chest tightened. I didn't know how to step into that world without feeling like an intruder. Daniel's mother, Grace, appeared first. She was a woman with soft eyes and an energy that filled the room before she even spoke. "You must be Elena," she said, pulling me into a hug before I could even respond. I stiffened for a second, caught off guard by the simple warmth of her touch. But something about her embrace melted my hesitation. It wasn't polite or practiced. It was real. The dinner table was long and crowded with bowls of mashed potatoes, roasted vegetables, and dishes that looked like they'd been passed down for generations. People made space for me without question, sliding plates and glasses as though I belonged there. For a moment, I just sat quietly, overwhelmed by the sound of forks clinking, stories being told, laughter bouncing around the room. I expected to be invisible, the way I always was at home. Instead, I found myself at the center of gentle questions. Daniel's father asked about my studies. His sister leaned over to ask about the book I had been reading. Even the younger cousins chimed in, giggling as they teased Daniel in front of me. I wasn't used to being asked, and more than that, I wasn't used to being listened to. Every time I answered, someone's eyes met mine, really met mine, as though they cared about what I had to say. Halfway through the meal, Grace reached across the table and took my hand. Her skin was warm, her grip firm but comforting. She looked me straight in the eye and said, "Welcome to the family, sweetheart, in must-taste." The words caught me off guard. My throat tightened, and I had to blink back tears before anyone noticed. No one had ever said that to me before. Not without some condition. Not without some unspoken demand tied to it. In that moment, something inside me softened, like a part of my heart that had been frozen for years had started to thaw. As the conversation carried on around me, I let myself sink into the sound of it all, the clinking, the chatter, the love that filled the air so effortlessly. For once, I didn't feel like a shadow at the edge of the room. I felt like I was finally sitting where I belonged. I couldn't wait to tell Clara about that evening. She was the one friend I trusted with the fragile parts of my heart. The one person who had seen me through the loneliness of growing up unseen. Sitting across from her at our favorite diner, I could still feel the echo of warmth from Daniel's family wrapped around me, and I wanted to share it before it faded. The words tumbled out of me faster than I expected. I told her about the dinner table, about the way Grace hugged me as though she had known me forever. I described the laughter, the questions, the way no one made me feel like an outsider. It was like I had stepped into a world I'd always dreamed existed, but never believed I'd get to touch. My voice wavered as I admitted how moved I was when Grace reached across the table and called me family. Clara smiled as she listened, nodding in all the right places. She stirred her coffee slowly, the spoon clinking against the mug in a steady rhythm. "That sounds wonderful," she said softly. "I'm glad you found that. Vein burspadi and stang." Her words were kind, but there was something in her eyes that caught me off guard. A flicker, quick and almost invisible, like a shadow passing behind a window. For just a second, I thought I saw envy. Or maybe it was something sharper, something she tried to bury under that polite smile. I brushed it aside at first. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe I was just too sensitive. But the feeling stayed with me. The way her lips curled into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The way her questions about Daniel's family were brief and clipped. Like she didn't want to know too much. I kept talking anyway. Too full of hope to stop. I told her how Daniel looked at me. How he made me feel seen in a way no one else ever had. Clara laughed lightly. Almost on cue. But then her gaze drifted to the window. Distant. Sounds like they're perfect, she said. Taking another sip of coffee. Her tone was casual. But the words hung heavier than she meant them to. I wanted to reach across the table and tell her she didn't have to be perfect for me to love her friendship. I wanted to explain that Daniel's family didn't erase the years she had been my safe place. But I didn't. Instead, I smiled and kept the moment light. Though something in my chest tightened, we finished our meal. And Clara hugged me before we parted ways. It was the kind of hug that should have reassured me. But as I walked home, I couldn't shake the image of her eyes. The way they had flashed with something unspoken. It was small. Almost invisible. But I felt it. A tiny crack in the foundation of our friendship. I didn't know it then. But that flicker of jealousy would grow, casting longer shadows than I could have ever imagined. I will never forget the night Daniel asked me to marry him. It was late in the evening, after a long week of work, and he had suggested we take a walk by the river. The air was crisp. The kind of cool that wakes you up. And the city lights shimmered on the water like scattered diamonds. I thought it was just another one of our quiet strolls. The kind where we held hands and talked about nothing and everything. But then he stopped. Right beneath a row of trees strung with golden lights, I felt his hand slip away from mine. And before I realized what was happening, he was kneeling on one knee. My breath caught in my chest. I could barely hear the words through the rush of blood in my ears. But I saw the small velvet box. The ring gleaming inside. "Elena," he said, his voice steady. "Will you marry me?" The world tilted. For a moment, I could hardly believe this man. This kind and steady soul wanted to spend his life with me. My hands flew to my mouth, and tears spilled before I could stop them. I whispered, "Yes." Then louder, "Yes." He slipped the ring onto my finger, and the cheers of a few strangers nearby filled the night. I laughed through my tears as he stood and pulled me into his arms. For the first time in my life, happiness didn't feel like something fleeting, something borrowed. It felt real. It felt mine. The first person I wanted to tell was my mother. Despite everything, some part of me still longed for her approval. I still believed maybe this news would finally make her proud of me. My fingers trembled as I dialed her number. Daniel's arm wrapped around me. She answered quickly, her voice as sharp and composed as always. "Elena? What is it?" I could barely contain my joy. "Mom, Daniel just proposed." I said yes. "I'm engaged." There was a pause. Just long enough for my heart to leap in anticipation. Then, her response came. Cool and detached. "Well, I suppose congratulations are in order." And it made. Before I could reply, she continued, her tone shifting as if brushing my news aside. "You know, Isabelle just signed her first advertising contract. It's small, but it's a good start for her portfolio. She's really making a name for herself." In it, Tad. I froze. The smile still plastered on my face, but hollow now. My chest tightened. I forced a laugh, trying to keep the joy alive. "That's great for Isabelle." "Mom, but did you hear me? I'm engaged. Have you can decide of self?" "Yes. Yes," she said briskly. "Of course. I'm happy for you, Elena. But you really should call your sister and congratulate her. It's such an important step for her career. Have you can decide of self?" The light inside me flickered. I bit down hard on my lip. The tears that had moments ago been from joy now threatening to spill from something else entirely. I murmured, something polite. I said goodbye, and ended the call. Daniel was watching me closely, his hand still around mine. "Everything okay?" he asked gently. I nodded, though my throat ached. "She knows. That's what matters. We're doing full. But inside, I felt the sting. The night that was supposed to belong to me, to us, had been overshadowed once again by Isabelle. My laughter from earlier felt like it had been doused in cold water. And though I leaned into Daniel's embrace, a piece of my heart curled inward. Aching from the wound my mother never seemed to stop inflicting. That night, as I lay beside Daniel, staring at the ring glittering faintly in the dark, I told myself her reaction didn't matter. But the truth was, it did. It always did. A few days after Daniel proposed, I was still carrying the glow of that night inside me. Even if my mother's reaction had dimmed it, I told myself it didn't matter, that I had Daniel and his family. And that was enough. What I didn't know was that, somewhere across town, Isabelle had found a new game to play. She reached out to Clara, who had been my anchor through so many years of uncertainty. Clara, who knew my insecurities better than anyone. I wasn't there, but I can picture it now as clearly as if I had been. Clara sitting across from Isabelle at a quiet cafe, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. Listening, Isabelle leaning in, her voice soft, conspiratorial, dripping with the kind of sweetness that hides poison underneath. Elena has never really seen you. Has she? Isabelle murmured. She's always been the center of her own world. You've just been standing in the background, like a shadow. Tenning is a covertly passive. I imagine Clara stiffening, the way her eyes would dart away, uncomfortable but unwilling to admit that the words were hitting something raw, because Clara had confessed things to me in the past. Little hints of how she sometimes felt less important, overlooked. I had brushed it off, never realizing how deep those feelings ran. Isabelle knew. She always knew where the cracks were, and she pressed on them. Relentless. You've been her loyal friend. But tell me, has she ever chosen you over herself, over Daniel, over anyone? No. Clara. She doesn't see you. She never has. And she never will. Jason Itman, a speeder and the new need in event. Clara must have shaken her head. Tried to argue. I know her heart, she's not cruel. Not easily swayed. But I also know how doubt can creep in like a draft under a door. Subtle at first, then chilling everything it touches. By the time Isabelle leaned back, satisfied with her work, Clara was silent, torn. Meanwhile, I was at home, completely unaware, folding bridal magazines closed with a smile, dreaming about colors and flowers, never imagining that one of the people I trusted most was being pulled away from me, thread by thread. Looking back, I realize how easy it must have been for Isabelle. Clara had always been protective of me, but she also longed for recognition of her own. Isabelle didn't need to create jealousy out of thin air. She only had to water the tiny seed that was already there, and she did it masterfully. That evening, Clara called me. Her voice sounded normal, light, even, but there was something I couldn't quite place: hesitation. Maybe. Or distance. I told her about Daniel's family hosting us for dinner that weekend. About how his mother was already treating me like a daughter. Clara laughed and said she was happy for me. But I heard the strain in it. I ignored it, telling myself I was imagining things. The truth was, shadows had already begun to stretch between us. Though I couldn't see them yet, Isabelle had planted them carefully, and I was too wrapped up in my own fragile joy to notice. If I had known what Isabelle said to her, those sharp little whispers meant to slice through trust, I might have fought harder to hold Clara close. I might have reminded her of all the times she had been my safe place, the sister I chose when my own family left me wanting. But I didn't know. I was blind. And she was slipping. And Isabelle, with her calculating smile, was winning. At the time, I thought the storm was only in my relationship with my mother. I didn't realize another one was gathering quietly, waiting to break open where it would hurt most, between me and the friend I thought would never leave my side. The weeks leading up to the wedding should have been filled with joy, But instead, I felt pieces of my world slipping through my fingers. First came the silence from Clara. She stopped returning my messages. Always too busy to meet. When I finally confronted her, her words cut deeper than I expected. Elena, I can't do this anymore. I don't think I've ever really mattered to you. Not. I stood there, stunned, unable to breathe. This was the woman who had held my hand through heartbreaks, who knew my darkest thoughts. And she was walking away on the eve of the most important day of my life. I wanted to beg her to stay, to remind her of all the love we had shared. But the look in her eyes told me she had already decided. Isabelle's poison had done its work. Then there was my family, or rather, the absence of them. My calls went unanswered. My invitations ignored. It was as if my engagement had erased me from their lives. On the morning of the wedding, I sat alone in my room, veil draped across my lap, wondering if I had made a mistake, believing love could heal all of this. And then Daniel's family knocked on the door. His mother walked in first. Her eyes warm, her arms open. "We're here, sweetheart," she said, behind her. His father, his sisters, his cousins all smiling, all ready to walk this path with me. In that moment, I realized family wasn't just the people you were born to. It was the people who chose you, who stayed. When I walked down the aisle on Daniel's arm, I wasn't just promising him forever. I was promising myself something too. As I spoke my vows, my voice steady despite the tears in my eyes, I said, "I choose us, and I choose me." There's an house mispeated. After the ceremony, when the guests had gone and the music had quieted, my phone rang. It was my mother. Her voice was sharp, blaming Isabelle, blaming everyone but herself. I took a deep breath and said, "No, Mom, this was your choice. Yours and Dad's." Then I hung up, and for the first time in my life, I felt free.